Yeah, I think that I agree so far with everything the panel said, so you may not have much of a debate today unless the audience is going to really engage here.
Okay, thanks all for coming in. Bye.
The issues that George brought up, the militarization and the politicization of humanitarian assistance are extremely complex. And as a means to begin to dissect and separate these issues, I think it's going to be incumbent on donors, donor nations that support the kinds of agencies like are represented here today, that they not request us to buy into their strategies of political maneuvers and militarization of humanitarian assistance. And it's going to take a significant work by those donors to behave in such a way that they're creating that space for us to be able to operate and for those people in Kivu to be able to exist in a manner that is befitting them. Some of the practical, real steps that can be taken is to start separating away the funding mechanisms that many nation states now use in their assistance that they're supporting organizations like ours. The 1207 monies that have come out in U.S. government and the coin strategy, the counterinsurgency strategies that many NGOs are now being asked to either buy into or step aside from, determine a lot, and they contribute quite a bit to this eroding of the humanitarian space that we're all suffering from.
Melker, the ICRC has negotiated a strategy of acceptance that's excuse me, you're sort of where all the other NGOs are trying to get to. So what was the strategy?
Well, I don't know that. I mean, I think that humanitarian space has room for diversity quite a lot, and I think the ICRC method is one out of many possible ways of operating, with depending on what your objectives are, your operating policies, and I think importantly as well, as Charlotte said, your resources. And the ICRC is in the fortunate position that we have a slightly unique mandate given to us by the international community, which a consequence of that, one of the consequences of that is that we have few funding problems, which I think is unique, rather unique in the humanitarian community. We can, I mean, the budget, security issues are never sort of under a budget constraints. But I think what we've done over the last couple of years, and I think that we've all seen the change over the last few years after 9/11, etc. And we all remember, of course, the attacks in Iraq on both the ICRC and the UN, which I think were turning points to some extent for the humanitarian community as a whole, and certainly for the ICRC, because our way of operating as neutral, independent, impartial humanitarians was brutally questioned, and we lost, only in 2003, we lost 4 colleagues in Iraq and Afghanistan alone. Quite understandably, I think we went through a great degree of questioning and soul-searching within the institution, and I think together with the rest of the humanitarian community. And we made a few important decisions back then that I believe are still relevant today. Now, the first one of those was to maintain an operational approach of proximity to our victims based on the acceptance of all the parties to the conflict. That was being put in severe question back then. I mean, now I think we're moving a little bit away from that black and white debate where more and more people are realizing that maybe it's not over, sort of the humanitarian era, and that there is room for us. The second decision we took was to maintain a decentralized security management, believing that those people who are in the field are best placed to understand the environment in which we operate and the impact or the perception of our organization in that environment. A third decision that we took was to engage in a much more structured and global way with the Muslim community. to try and build acceptance for not only the organization but the ideals themselves.
Symbol.
Yeah, and in fact, and this is perhaps where the ICRC bucks a little bit the trend of recent years. In fact, those losses that we took in 2003, those were the last times that the ICRC was directly targeted with a lethal outcome. So for 6 years now, we've, out of our own cleverness or dumb luck or divine providence, I dare not say, but the fact remains that for 6 years we haven't had a direct targeting with a deadly outcome. As well as the fact that over the last couple of years we have been able to expand our operational surface in complicated contexts like Afghanistan, like Sudan, Somalia, and more recently Pakistan. Now, we obviously draw our lessons from that and would be happy, we're happy to engage in these kind of contexts or others to try and share so that others can draw whatever they see useful from that in their own way of operating.
Mr. Rupp, is it the ICRC's luck?
You want me to choose between dumb luck, divine providence, and cleverness?
I want you to tell us what you're doing towards achieving, not being targeted and achieving security for your staff and ensuring that you stay doing the work necessary in the areas that you're in.
Well, we are a little different from ICRC in that we certainly emphatically embrace the norms of impartiality in delivering assistance and operational independence from any donors, including any government supporters. But we don't pretend that in every case we're impartial, and that lends us, exposes us in particular ways. For example, in Afghanistan, we've been present since the late 1980s, working and helping refugees or displaced people within Afghanistan to get back on their feet. And we were quite deliberately, we worked all through the period of the Taliban and were not identified in any way with any government organization. But since the establishment of the Karzai government, we have been willing to implement programs through the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Rural Development, and that we recognize does compromise our neutrality in a way that it complicates our exposures. Nonetheless, we have the programs that we've administered have been deeply embedded in local communities. Virtually all of our staff are Afghans. And the protection that we have for our security really does come from the fact that we are affirmed by those communities as providing services that they have elected to receive, since that's the way, for example, the National Solidarity Program works. The local community councils identify projects that are then funded through the Afghan Ministry of Rural Development, and that doesn't change the fact that we are associated with the government of Afghanistan, but in providing services that are elected locally. A complicated balancing act that's somewhat different from ICRC's ability to claim complete neutrality.
So you found that you could actually negotiate some neutrality or move away from some neutrality in order to stay and work in that. Well,
we are now involved in over 1,500 villages in Afghanistan, many of them in what the United States would call, or NATO coalition would call, insecure areas. And we are involved with 100% Afghan staff working on projects that those local villages themselves have identified. Now, I've had a chance to visit some of those villages and the kind of local ownership and pride in those projects, whether it's a water and sanitation system or whether it's a school or whether it's a viaduct that connects two villages. The local ownership of those projects is so high that there's a significant threshold to get over before those would become targets by the Taliban or anyone else. I'm not suggesting that will never happen, but the security we do have is because we are embraced by those communities and have worked with them on those projects.
How much